Our final speaker probably needs no introduction to most people. He is one of our great thought leaders and challengers of the industry. Mike Ritchie has over 20 years experience in the waste and resource recovery industry. He has a long history working with clients as diverse as ASX 2000 listed companies right through to local and small business and state and federal government. Since 1990, Mike has held a senior management positions in Suez, Visy, WSN, a number of councils, and he's also involved in WAMA and current WAMA board director. He served as a sessional commissioner at New South Wales Land and Environment Court and was a member of the Ministerial Advisory Council on Governance for Waste and Recycling in Victoria. Mike's going to tell us how we just need to get on with it. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you, everybody, for joining. What a great day. My talk is really to encourage the New South Wales government and the Victorian governments and state governments around the country to focus on the key drivers, as well as all of those policy principles and education and engagement and all of that broader stuff. We also need to look very clearly at the tonnages that are involved here if we're going to set weight-based tonnages and waste-based targets. And that is not to diminish all the other things that states are trying to do, but really to say we have to prioritise our action. So let's prioritise on things that really drive the tonnes towards the targets. As I've said many times, it's not for us to set the strategic goals, that's the state's job. But if they're going to set targets that involve tonnages, then they need to then allow us to get on with driving those tonnes out of landfill. So this talk is to try and prioritise some of that, while of course not diminishing all the other things that Barack and others have said. But I also want to encourage everyone to have a good look at that Victorian infrastructure report. It is an excellent approach and I totally endorse it, and hopefully some of that flavour has fed into my presentation. So the principles of what makes a good strategy and understanding how waste actually economy. The first principle, to outline a few broad principles, is that waste is like a river. It flows downhill to the cheapest price. We generate 54 million tonnes of it. And if we're going to set targets, left, C&D waste, organics and metals. And if you look in the middle of that flow, which is to represent a river, the big tonnages are still organics, paper, masonry, plastic. Try and get it to go to the next slide. Have I frozen, Gail? Can you hear me?
No, you are freezing. I think NBN overload today, but you're going fine, Mike.
Okay.
So sorry, everyone. Today's just been a few technical. Oh.
I've got to go back to slide number 2. There we are. Most recycling is subsidised by someone. So we really have to understand the economics of waste in Australia. It's all very well to say we've got to push stuff up the hierarchy, but if nobody wants it, no one's prepared to pay for it, then you're just wasting your time and public money. The only two products in the Australian economy, really, that recycle themselves are metal and cardboard. Everything else costs someone in the economy. It's all subsidised. So we need to focus on the best bang for our collective buck. And while it's great to try and recycle polystyrene or recycle plastic bags or cigarette butts, they're incredibly expensive to recycle and not really worth the effort unless someone is prepared to subsidise it. The third is that the landfill levies are by far the biggest driver in the economy, driving recycling as we know it today. And I encourage the states to follow New South Wales, Vic and South Australia that are now all pushing their levies up towards the $145 a tonne, because that creates the headroom for further recyclers to enter the market and do good things with products. The fourth principle is that organics is by far the biggest component of waste to landfill, almost 50%, as Alyssa said in the last slide. And if we're going to achieve tonnes, we need to focus on organics. And to make my introductory point again, the broad principles of generating less waste, improving collection and sorting, planning for infrastructure and creating end markets are great, and no one's going to disagree with them. We need to do those, we need to do them faster. But underneath that, the next level down is what are the tonnes that we're going to focus on within each of those areas, and what should the priority for our actions be? And that's what I want to set out in this next couple of slides. So what makes a good strategy? The EPA's simple strategy in New South Wales I like. It's where are we now, where are we trying to get to, and how are we going to get there? And I've set up my little talk to look at the 2021 targets, and then for New South Wales, but it's applicable across the country, and then the 2030 target, which is the national target of 80% diversion from landfill by 2030, and that has been endorsed by COAG and the Meeting of Environment Ministers. So that is our 2030 target, and I'm sure that all states will adopt that or go higher if they want to. So if we just look at what is the maths around those tonnage targets, just taking the 2021 target in New South Wales as our starting position, which we're not going to achieve, what would we need to do? So I'm trying to set out in these next slides, well, here are the priorities. So you can see there, construction and demolition, our gap is 380,000 tonnes. Commercial and industrial, we need another 0.75 million tonnes to achieve the 21 target, and MSW 1.2 million tonnes. So there are, if you boil it all down, as Alyssa just said, there are really only 5 actions that make all the difference in terms of tonnage. They are banning organics from landfill, or setting some price point in the market, or setting some minimum collection standard for collecting organics from generators. We need a big, bold action in that space. Energy from waste, the landfill levy, as I've said, setting those price signals, the grants and using the levy not only as a price signal, but also as a revenue source for grants and for funding, and then to do something around domestic recycling because it is an opportunity that still has some growth. And those 5 approaches apply to all 3 waste streams, C&I, C&D and MSW. And I'm just going to show in a couple of slides how that makes a difference to each of those streams. So if you look at the C&D stream in New South Wales, the target is another 0.38 million tonnes in red that we need to grow. And look, 2 grants from Waste Less, Recycle More would get us over that easily. So that's 2 grants from the government under Waste Less, Recycle More of about $5 million each, and you'd cover that target. And I have to say at this point, I congratulate the government on Waste Less, Recycle More grants. It has been a brilliant program, and hopefully they commit to doing more of it. And that is true of all states as well. There needs to be much greater hypothecation of the landfill levy towards grants and infrastructure. For C&I, there's a range of instruments that would do the same job. The target is 0.75 million tonnes. If you banned organics from landfill, as they have in Europe, which, you know, in Europe, you cannot put unprocessed organics into landfill. You must put it through a processing facility. Or in America, they've said if you generate more than 200 kilos of food waste from a restaurant per week, then you must have a collection system for it. Either of those mechanisms will work, and that would deliver 1 million tonnes of additional diversion. That alone fixes the C&I target. Energy from waste in the C&I space would generate about 0.9 million tonnes of additional diversion, assuming about an 80% diversion rate for that went into the energy from waste facility. And the levy and grants here conservatively would generate 0.7 million tonnes of additional diversion. And I've just assumed for the sake of argument that half of that is delivered through additional price signals, through source separation at the generator's site. So that's the university engaging in more plastic recycling or paper recycling or timber recycling or whatever. And another half of that generated by building C&I sorting facilities. And in New South Wales, we only have 3 very small C&I sorting facilities, and there are none in the rest of Australia doing at-scale commercial and industrial sorting. Many of the C&D processes do a little bit of C&I, but there are almost no bespoke commercial and industrial sorting facilities in Australia, and that is a huge opportunity. So there, those few actions, those 3 actions would deliver 2 million tonnes plus, or 90% plus in the C&I space. And finally, for people on this call, many of you are local government. If you look at household waste, the target is 1.2 million tonnes. And if we banned unprocessed organics, again, as Alyssa just recommended for Infrastructure Victoria, every house having a 3rd bin producing food and garden organics, that would alone divert an additional 1.1 million tonnes. And that, in fact, was promised by Robin Parker back in 1998 in New South Wales. So 20 years later, we still haven't done it, and we need to do it. There is still some low-hanging fruit in curbside recycling and the container deposit scheme. 22% of the red bin is still curbside recyclables, and we need a systematic, standardised process for getting that out. So standardised materials going into the yellow top bin, standardised signage, education. In my view, we should include wine in the container deposit scheme, wine bottles, because we're missing all of those and plenty of them are still going to landfill. And I think we should move the CDS rebate back up to 20 cents across the country as a national reform agenda. And that would capture a lot of the low-hanging CDS fruit. And finally, if we did energy from waste for the residual red-lidded bin only, and only after doing the first 2 of getting the organics out and the recyclables out of that red bin, if we put that into energy from waste, it would generate another 1 million tonnes of diversion. So those 3 actions, 2.1 million tonnes or 90% plus diversion from landfill, and also meets the 2030 targets. So putting all that together, and this is just a New South Wales example and just using the numbers that I crunched, but a decent strategy would do the same. Banning organics delivers you your lowest hanging fruit and at the cheapest rate for government. Energy from waste, 2 million tonnes, again, exceptionally effective. The levy and recycling and other grants. And they are, in a sense, combined because I've just used them to tell the New South Wales story as it applies here. Those 5 actions would deliver 90% plus recovery, generate over 20,000 jobs, involve $3 billion worth of investment along the lines of what Alyssa was talking about before, and it would achieve all of the 2030 and 2021 targets. There are some enabling actions that I say are equally important, but for the sake of this presentation, I've focused on the tonnes. And they're the kinds of things that Gail has talked about at length at various conferences. Market development to try and extract a bit more market pull. Planning for the infrastructure, as Alyssa just described. Fixing the planning scheme in New South Wales so it doesn't take 3 to 4 years or 5 or 10 years to get a planning approval. Fix the energy from waste policy. It is very clunky in New South Wales. We need to have consistent education for recycling. Increase the levy to drive that price signal, grants, and of course measure our successes. And for those of you who are not colourblind, I just as an aside threw in this map of New South Wales. For those of you who aren't colourblind, you might see a little red dot there. It's not a mistake. That is the amount of land in New South Wales that is needed to consume the compost if every house in New South Wales had a food and garden organics bin and put all of our organics into that bin. There is an unlimited market for compost and organics in Australia. It's a matter of getting the price signals right to get it out of the urban environment and back out to agriculture and to farmers. Thank you very much.
Mike, that was great. I'll just get the girls to come back on because they are girls. I'll just ask you one question, Mike, before we'll probably run 10 minutes over. So if you can stay, please do, because there are some other questions. Mike, I love the concept of tons to hit targets, but with the increase of words such as circular, no one's actually talked carbon. How do we get carbon back into the discussion, or into the discussion, which it should be, to achieve targets? So, because carbon, obviously organics, that's why we'll keep talking about organics, it's the biggest impact, but we need to think not just tons, but also carbon, don't you think? And how should we do it?
Absolutely, and I didn't have time to go into the whole carbon equation, but if you got all of our organics out of landfill, it would abate 2.7% of Australia's emissions. The recycling sector already abates 50 million tonnes of emissions, but it doesn't show in our sector's accounts. It shows in the aluminium smelters accounts, or the coal-fired power station accounts, when they're burning biomass instead of coal. So there's at least 2.7% of Australia's emissions if we got the organics out, plus the additional recycling embodied energy. On the maths that we've done, somewhere around 60 million tonnes of abatement, which is a big step towards the Paris commitments.
Yeah, and we've got a comment here from Waz. Yes, nearly all the European Union documents are based on carbon and weight. And I think, for that to be normalised, I guess Baharak and New South Wales, we've kind of got the start of that with a separate 2030 strategy of decarbonising New South Wales. But it would be particularly awesome, don't we all think, that if we put carbon and tonnes in the same strategy to change that paradigm.
Yes.
All right. I just had a question about, if we ban organics, will that not affect the generation of landfill gas, which will affect the generation of electricity from gas? Mike, you might want to start with that one.
Yeah, it will. Ultimately, it'll take 30 years to flow through from the, the organics we've already put into landfill will keep emitting for 30 years, but it will change the output gas generation from landfills over time. And that's a good thing. While it's great that we capture that gas, we also don't capture about 50% of it, and that's fugitive emissions, and represents about 11 million tonnes of Australia's greenhouse gas footprint, or 2.7%. So while it's great that our big landfills do capture the gas, and we need to do more of it, we need to capture, all the landfill stock has to capture their gas, it will ultimately reduce the amount of gas generated, and therefore the electricity generated from those gas electricity generators on those landfills. But that's a small price to pay for reducing Australia's emissions by 3%.
This is probably one for all of you, because I don't think anyone was actually saying just increase the levy. I think, Mike, you were saying that getting the levy to a certain rate gives headspace, for your words. But we are conscious, probably in New South Wales today, we've been a bit of a one-trick town of just putting the levy up and not enough policy. What are the other levers? And especially as we move away from talking about just diversion to landfill, Baharak and Alyssa, what are the levers that you guys are pulling or proposing to pull in your strategies that really get that resource recovery, that repair, that avoidance? What sort of policies are going to be key to those sort of successes? Maybe Alyssa, if you could start, if you've got your head in that space.
Sure, thanks, Gail. So look, both the Recycling Victoria policy and our advice to government have focused on multiple levers. So there's everything from waste minimisation to doing better with product stewardship and extended producer responsibility. To we have, like Mike and you have mentioned, although we have focused on, and the Victorian government has adopted broadly the national targets that are focused on tonnage, we have recommended a move to more complex targets over time, particularly looking at things like carbon. And the reason for that is we really need to do a bit more work on our fundamentals in terms of the data, and making sure that our data is accurate, and therefore designing good interventions. So we don't want to put the cart before the horse. So there are a range of actions that we have recommended, that it's not just the landfill levy.
Yeah. Baharak, and then we might touch on data after that.
Yes, and I agree with Alyssa's approach, and that's certainly what we're looking at, and it's that packaging. So reducing waste at the design and production stage, and also longevity of the products and how can they be kept in the economy. It's about the innovation, about new ways of and technologies to come into play. as well as the sorting and the collecting. And the levy is one lever amongst many. And any other strategies we've looked at overseas as well, it is that combination, or the right combination of initiatives across all that life cycle that make the difference. It's not just the one, if you want to avoid unintended consequences and, you know, get into that circular space.
Yeah, but I don't mean to sound dismissive, but I think we all know that it, as an economic tool, it's an awesome tool, and it's very, very hard to do the more complex. You know, in Australia, we haven't effectively done an extended producer responsibility scheme. We've squibbed CDS. We haven't actually made the producers take it back. We don't have any mandated product stewardship. We pretend APCO is effective. God, don't start me. You know, so where is the will to really interfere with genuine policy levers? Because what the levy really does is give some funding into a system to do something other than divert. And but the problem we seem to have is we love to put the cost onto householders, like talk forth bin, don't start me. But it's like, when are we going to make generators responsible? And I think that's the brave policy decisions you were talking about earlier, Barak, that, you know, if this is the time, like, please let us do it. Let's not tweak, let's take a systems-based approach into actually making that change and create that environment and that economy that we want to create. And I think that's the big challenge for all of us in this room.
Absolutely, Gail. And that, being a pragmatist, I say it's very, very difficult to go down that path and have any material effect on tonnages. And we've been doing that for 30 years. The single thing that's driving tonnes out of landfill today is the levy. And the driving, creating the market opportunities for recyclers to enter the market, put their hard-earned capital up and build businesses that pull tonnes out of landfill. And there are multiple, you know, Visi, you know, Benedict's, Better Grow, A&L, you know, these companies make money by sucking waste out of the organics and the material vacuum cleaners. They just suck the stuff up. And if you've got an underpriced landfill, that's where the tonnes are going. And the levy creates the headroom for them to do that. We know that. And it's all very well to say we've got a broader strategic agenda, and I get it. And if that was delivering the tonnes, I wouldn't need to articulate around continuing the price signals.
Yeah.
Government,
But even having this
conversation, they've got education and they've got regulation. Price, education, regulation. They've got to pull one of those levers. The only one that's working at the moment is price.